The blade was old.
Is full
The handle
of
was
terrifying
wrapped in
things,
cracked brown
but none
cord,
are quite
and the
like
steel
Rick's.
was dull in some
They called
places
him
from
an
years of
apex
use.
predator,
But Nora
a living
Vance kept
weapon
it sharp at the
forged in the
tip,
chaos
always
of a
at the
dying
tip.
star system.
She sat on a low
And I
crate
was his
outside
handler.
the delegation prep
My
room
name is
on
Dara,
board the
and
cradle,
my job was
the
to
great
keep the
ring
most
station
dangerous
orbiting the
creature in
gas
the known
giant's
galaxy.
Rev. The planet below
Come.
was orange
Rick's
and
wasn't
slow,
just fangs and
swirling in
claws.
silence.
He was telepathic.
She watched it while
a
she worked the
shapeshifter,
blade with
a
a small
being
stone.
of pure,
Short
lethal
strokes.
instinct.
No rush.
He was housed
Taryn
in
came
a
around the corner
containment
holding a
unit
data
the size
pad
of a city
and
block,
looking nervous.
a maze
He was
of
young,
reinforced
barely
alloys
20,
and energy fields.
and he wore his ambassador's
My
A
first
badge
day,
like it might
my
fall
predecessor,
off.
a
They're
man
ready,
with a haunted
he
look
said.
in his eyes,
Rail is
handed
asking
me
for
a
you.
data pad.
Nora put the stone
Rule
in her
1,
pocket
he said,
and slid the
never show
blade
fear.
into the sheath
He
at her
can
hip.
taste it.
She stood without
For
a
5
word
years,
and followed
that
him
was my
inside.
life.
The
I watched the
negotiation
gantries
chamber
above
was
his
wide
enclosure.
and cold.
My voice,
The light
only
came from
human sound he'd
strips in the
hear for
ceiling,
weeks.
pale and
I
even,
learned his
the
moods,
kind of light
the
that
subtle
showed
shift and the
everything.
shimmer of his skin
Long
from
tables
calm
faced
silver
each other.
to
The
agitated
human
crimson.
delegation sat on
I'd
one
read him
side.
ancient poetry,
Ambassador
describe
Rail
sunsets
was already
he'd
in
never
his
seen,
seat, his gray
and tell
jacket
him
neat,
stories of a
his
world
hands
called
folded.
Earth.
He was a
He'd
careful
just
man.
watch me with
He
those
had built his whole
intelligent,
career
unnerving
on
eyes.
careful words
His
spoken at
form
the right
rippling
time.
like mercury.
Nora stood behind his left
He never
shoulder.
spoke back.
That was her
But I
place.
knew he was listening.
Not at the table.
He learned.
Behind it, the
One
Vorith
cycle,
delegation
a solar
entered from the
flare,
far door.
stronger
They were
than
tall.
predicted,
The shortest
tore
among
through our
them
sector.
stood close to 2.5
Alarms shrieked.
meters. Their skin
Red
was a
lights
deep
bathed
gray
the
brown,
corridors.
plated at
The
the
containment
shoulders
field
and along the
flickered,
jaw
then
by
died.
natural hard ridges. They
My
wore
blood
their
ran
ceremonial
cold.
blades on their
A
belts the
metallic
way some
screech
people
echoed
wore
through the
medals.
facility, the
Not for
sound of
use,
Rick's tearing
for
through his
statement.
prison.
The last one through the door
Security
was the
teams
tallest.
scrambled.
He moved like
Their
he
pulse
knew
rifles
every eye in the
useless
room
against him.
was already on him.
I heard the
His
screams
name,
over the comms.
as the translation
then
bead in
silence.
Nora's ear rendered it,
I was in the
was
central
Dusk of
control room
Blades.
trying to
A warrior
reboot the
cast
system
name.
when
He
the
had
door
earned it
buckled
young,
inward.
according to the
And there
background
he
files
was.
that he scanned the
No
human
longer
table
the
slowly.
shimmering liquid in
His
the
yellow eyes
but a
moved from
towering
Rail to the
beast of
junior
obsidian
delegates
scales
and then
and
stopped.
razor-sharp
They
lens.
stopped on Nora.
His
He
eyes
said
burning
something
with
in the
newfound
Vorith
freedom.
tongue. The bead
He
translated
stalked
it
towards
with a
me,
small delay.
a low growl
They brought a ground
rumbling in his
creature for
chest.
decoration.
The
How
security
quaint.
chief's
A
voice
few of the
crackled
Vorith
in my
behind
ear.
him made a low
Dara,
sound.
get out
Not
of
quite
there.
laughter.
We're
Something
initiating
close.
self-destruct.
Rail did not
I had
move.
seconds.
He kept his
My
hands
training
folded
screamed at
and
me
his
to
face
run
neutral.
to save myself.
Under the table.
But I
Out
looked
of
at
sight,
Rick's.
he pressed
At
two
this
fingers
magnificent,
gently
terrifying
against
creature
Nora's
I had
wrist.
spent years
A
with.
signal they had used before.
And I did the one
It meant,
thing that made
"Not
no
now."
sense.
Nora did
I
not
didn't
move
run.
either.
I
She
stood
looked
my
at the
ground,
wall
my
behind
heart
Dusk
hammering
of
against my
Blades.
ribs.
Not
but
at
I
him.
forced my
Through
breathing
him.
to steady.
The way you look through a
I
window
looked him in the eye
when there is
and
nothing
spoke his
worth
name.
seeing outside.
Not with authority,
Her right
but with
hand
the
rested
same
at her
calm
side.
tone I'd
Close
used
to the
for
hilt of the
5
blade,
years.
she called last
Rick's,
word.
I said
She
softly.
did not reach for it. The
It's
session
okay.
began.
He paused.
Rail spoke
head tilted.
first, laying
His
out the
form
terms
began
of the
to soften,
proposed
the
equal
sharp
trade
edges
agreement.
melting away.
His voice was steady.
The
He had
obsidian
done this
scales
before.
receded.
He knew how to make an
replaced
offer
by the
sound like a
familiar,
conversation.
calm
but
silver.
Dusk of
He
Blades
was still
listened
immense,
with his arms crossed.
still deadly.
He answered
but
with
he
long
was.
pauses between
Listening.
sentences.
They're
The
going to
Vorith
destroy
way of
this
showing that
whole
what had been
place,
said
Rick's.
barely
Us
deserved
with
a
it.
response.
Slowly,
Equal trade.
I extended
He
a
said
hand.
through the bead.
The
Was a
ultimate
concept
breach
built
of
for
protocol.
parties of equal
The
standing.
ultimate sign
The
of
humans
trust
had not
or
demonstrated
foolishness.
standing. They
He
had
lowered his
demonstrated
massive
need.
head.
There was
his
a difference.
alien features just
Rail nodded
inches from
slowly
my palm.
and said they were prepared
For
to
the first
discuss
time,
what
I
demonstration
felt a voice in my
might
mind,
satisfy the
not my
Vorith
own.
Council. The Dusk of Blades
It wasn't
looked at Nora
words,
again.
but a
He
feeling,
said,
a wave of
perhaps they
curiosity,
could start by
of
sending
understanding.
the decoration back to
He
wherever
nudged
it came
my
from.
hand.
The
A
room was
gesture so
quiet.
gentle,
Counselor
it defied
Sova,
his entire
the one
being.
female Vorith
In
at
that
the table,
moment,
looked
I
down
knew
at her hands.
He wasn't
Taryn,
just a monster.
standing along the side wall,
and I
went
wasn't
very
just
still.
his keeper.
Nora
The
said
self-destruct
nothing.
countdown
Rail
blared.
moved the conversation
I had a
forward.
choice to make.
He asked about
not
the
just for my
specific
life,
trade
but
routes
for
under
his.
dispute.
And it
Dusk
was a
of
choice
Blades
that would
stopped
change the
looking at
galaxy
Nora
forever.
and turned back to the
Thanks
table.
for watching.
The session
If you
continued
enjoyed this
0.2
story,
hours
make
later.
sure to like
It
and
ended ended with
subscribe
nothing
for more
decided.
tales from the edge
Dusk
of the
of Blades
universe.
walked out
See you
ahead of
next
his
time.
delegation, his blades catching the light. He did not look back. Rail waited until the room was clear. Then he turned in his seat and looked at Nora. "You handled that well," he said quietly. Nora looked at the far door where the Vorth had gone. "We got nothing today. We got the next session," Rail said. "That's something." She nodded slowly. It was something. She knew that. Rail had been doing this work for 30 years, and he was right more often than not. Words, he always said, are how civilizations move. Blades are how they stop. She believed that. She did believe it. But she also knew something Rail did not always account for. Sometimes, the only reason words were allowed to happen at all was because someone was willing to pick up a blade and stand still. She followed Taryn, out of the chamber. The gas giant Serev turned slowly below the station, orange and enormous, indifferent to all of them. She would be back in her seat behind rail tomorrow. She would be quiet again tomorrow. But tonight, she sat alone in the small observation room near the crew deck, took out last word, and sharpened the tip, short strokes. Norus. Dinner on the cradle was served in a long, narrow room that smelled of recycled air and instant rice. Taryn sat across from Nora with a tray. He was not really eating from dut. He had been working up to something for 10 minutes. She could tell by the way he kept opening his mouth and then drinking from his cup instead. Finally, he said it. Why didn't you say anything? We called you that. Nora looked at her food. She had heard the question before. Different people had asked it at different points in her life. I was 7 years old, she said, when I first understood what it felt like to be looked at like I did not matter. Taryn waited. There was a boy on Caro Ridge, older than me. He used to walk through our block of the colony and knock things off people's fences. Tools, planters, whatever was there. He never said anything. He just knocked them off and kept walking, like the things did not belong to real people. What did you do? Nothing. I was 7. She ate something, but I watched him. I watched the way he moved, the way he never looked at the thing he knocked over, only forward. That told me everything I needed to know about him. Taryn frowned. What did it tell you? That he never expected anyone to pick the things back up and put them in his way. She set her utensil down. Outside the small porthole beside them, the stars were fixed and white. Caro Ridge was somewhere in that direction. She could not see it. I grew up on a hard colony, she said. Gravity was wrong. Heavier than Earth. The native animals were built for it, and we were not. The big ones, the ones we called ridge runners, could go through a fence like it was made of paper. We lost 3 livestock shelters in my first 2 years there. Taryn had stopped pretending to eat. When I was 14, Nora continued, there was a bad storm season. It ran for 6 weeks, and it pushed the ridge runners down from the high ground. One got inside the perimeter during a night storm. Big one, the kind that could flip a ground vehicle if it wanted to. She paused, not for effect. She was just remembering the sound of the rain that night. Heavy and sideways. 3 adults froze. 2 of them were experienced colonists who had been on Caro Ridge longer than I had been alive. One ran. I don't blame any of them. Your body decides things before your mind can argue. What did you do? Taryn asked. His voice was lower now. I was closest to the equipment shed. I picked up the first tool I could reach. A soil cutting blade. Long handle. Heavy head. I put myself between the ridge runner and the group of children who were standing against the far fence. She pushed up her left sleeve. The scar was pale and thick, running from her inner wrist to just below the elbow. It got me once before the others came. By then, I had held it long enough for 2 adults to recover and bring the stun poles from a shed. Taryn stared at the scar. You were 14. I was the one who was standing there, she said simply. That was all. She rolled her sleeve back down. The point is not that I was brave, she said. The point is that the ridge runner had never once in its entire life encountered something my size that did not run. Its whole pattern of attack was built on the assumption that small things move away. When I did not move, it did not know what to do next. And that pause was enough. Taryn was quiet for a moment. Then he said, so when Dusk of Blades called you a decoration today, he has spent his entire life being the largest, most dangerous thing in the room. Nora said, everyone runs, or looks away, or says nothing. That is the world that built him. She picked up her cup. I just needed him to finish building his assumptions about me. Taryn opened his mouth to say something. Then a chime sounded from his data pad. He looked down at it, and his face changed. There's a memo from the Vorith delegation, he said slowly. For tomorrow's session, they're adding a component. Something called a strength demonstration. He looked up. We weren't told about this in advance. Nora was quiet. Rail is going to be furious, Taryn said. This is a trap. They want to make us look weak in front of the high speaker before the final vote. Yes, Nora said. What do we do? She stood, picked up her tray, and looked at him. Get some sleep, Taryn. Tomorrow is my moment. She walked to the tray return. She did not look worried. She did not look angry. She looked like a woman doing arithmetic in her head, counting the steps to somewhere she had already decided to go. The chamber was different the next morning. Someone had moved the side tables. In the open floor between the two delegation tables, a heavy post had been set into a floor mount. It was black and square, roughly a meter tall. In Vorth culture, Nora knew from the briefing files, it was called a standing point. It meant one thing, a formal test of worth. Rail stood near the entry with his arms at his sides and his jaw tight. Taryn handed him the Vorth memo again, as if reading it a second time would change it. "This is a deliberate provocation," Rail said quietly. "They added this without consent from the neutral chair. I'm going to object formally through High Speaker Oro before we sit." "That will take 2 days," Nora said. Rail looked at her. 2 days means the vote gets pushed. And if the vote gets pushed, the Vor's secondary block has time to pressure the fence-sitters, she said. "We lose the timing. We may lose the whole agreement." Rail was silent. He knew she was right. He was a man who chose words over speed, but he was not a man who refused to see the numbers. "The tradition," Nora said, "allows the challenge party to send any member of their delegation." "You're not going out there," Rail said. "The rule says any member." "Nora, the rule says any member," she said again. Flat, polite, finished, the session began. High Speaker Oro, a senior Vorth official whose plating had gone pale with age, called the room to order from a raised seat at the head of the chamber. He acknowledged the addition of the demonstration with the careful neutrality of someone who had seen this tactic many times and had chosen not to stop it. Dusk of Blades rose and spoke the formal challenge. His words were slow and deliberate, the way a person talks when they want every syllable to land. The translation bead rendered it clearly. The human delegation was invited to demonstrate their standing through the traditional exchange. Any member of the delegation could step forward. The challenge party had 1 minute to respond. Rail began to rise from his seat. Nora walked past him. She moved without rushing. She crossed the floor and stopped at the standing point, and she turned to face Dusk of Blades. She was a full meter shorter than him. Her hair was tied back. Her jacket was plain gray. The only thing at her hip was last word. The room went still. The Dusk of Blades looked at her for a long moment. Then he made the low sound again, almost laughter. "They send the decoration," he said. Counselor Sova, seated 3 chairs down from him, did not make the sound. She leaned forward slightly and watched. High Speaker Oro stated the rules in a formal tone. "Ceremonial blades only. No automatic modifications. First blood drawn and acknowledged, or a formal yield, would end the match. The honor of the standing point would go to the winner's delegation." The Dusk of Blades removed the long ceremonial blade from his belt and turned it once in his hand. It was beautiful, silver along the flat, dark at the edge. It was also longer than Nora's arm. Nora drew last word. Short, plain, worn at the handle. The kind of blade that looked like it had been used for actual work. Taryn, against the sidewall, looked like he might be sick. Rail stood at the table with his hands at his sides. He did not sit back down. He watched the Dusk of Blades step to his mark. He settled into the Vorth guard stance, weight back, blade angled up and out. It was a stance built for reach, built for someone who expected the fight to happen at a distance. Nora stepped to her mark. She did not take a guard stance. She stood straight, blade at her side, and she looked at him, not at his weapon. At him, the way you look at a ridge runner in the dark, watching for the weight shift, watching for the thing that happens just before the charge. That Dusk of Blades noticed. Something moved in his expression. Not quite uncertainty, but not pure confidence either. He looked down at her left forearm. She had not rolled her sleeve up. But when she gripped last word, her sleeve had pulled back slightly at the wrist, and the star of the pale scar was visible. Counselor Sova saw it. She leaned forward further. High Speaker Oro raised one hand. The chamber was completely silent. His hand came down. Dusk of Blades moved fast. He was not playing. There was no slow testing strike, no warning. He came forward in one long step and brought the blade across in a flat, horizontal sweep aimed at her shoulder level. Nora dropped. Not back. Down and forward. She dropped her weight and went under the blade and came up inside his reach before he could recover the swing. Her left hand pushed his elbow out. Last word came up. She stopped at 2 centimeters from his ribs. She stepped back. The room did not breathe. High Speaker Oro made no call. First blood had not been drawn. The exchange had ended in a hold, not a wound. The match continued. The Dusk of Blades turned and looked at her. The expression on his face had changed. The laughter was gone. He was still not worried. But he was paying attention now. He changed his grip. Blade shorter in his hand, elbow bent. A closer range stance. He had adapted. She noted that. He was not just a creature of arrogance. He had real skill. He came again. Faster this time, 2 strikes in a sequence, the second angled down. She moved with the first, redirected the second with the flat of last word, and felt the impact travel up her arm to her shoulder. He was strong. The redirect had cost her. He pressed the advantage. 3 more strikes, each one pushing her back across the floor. He was reading her movement now. The reach problem was his again. The third strike caught her. The tip of his blade opened a line across her upper left shoulder. Shallow, but real. The Dusk of Blades stepped back immediately. Under Vorith custom, he had drawn first blood. He had the right to call it. His delegation would take the standing point. He raised his head. Then he lowered his blade and waved his hand in dismissal. He did not call it. He looked at her wound and then at her face, and he said, "Finish it properly." He wanted more than a win. He wanted her to stop, to yield, to confirm everything he had assumed since he first saw her standing behind Rael's chair. Nora pressed her right hand against the cut for 2 seconds. She felt the warm sting of it. She had felt worse. Much worse. She looked at him. Then she did something he did not expect. She smiled. Small. Just at one corner of her mouth. She stopped moving the way she had been moving. She stopped trying to redirect and reposition. She stopped fighting the way someone trained in blade technique fights. She started fighting the way a 14-year-old girl in a colony world fights a ridge runner in a night storm. She went straight at him. She took a hit to her right forearm, a glancing strike she accepted completely, and used the momentum of his swing to pull herself around his left side. His blade arm was extended and momentarily past her. She was behind his reach and against his body, and she drove her left elbow hard into the back of his weapon hand. He did not drop the blade. But his grip broke for half a second. She spun under his arm. Last word came up with both hands on the hilt, and the tip stopped at the base of his throat. Oza, the nerve cluster under the chin plate. She had read about it in the briefing files. She had memorized it the same way she had memorized everything else about Vorth physiology. Quietly, without telling anyone that he could not move his head back. The wall was behind him. He looked down at her along the flat of the blade. His yellow eyes were very still. Nora held the position. Her shoulder was bleeding. Her right forearm was bruised through to the bone. She did not shake. She waited. High speaker Oro struck the tone bell. One clear ring that filled the chamber. Match concluded. The bead translated. Hold acknowledged. Dusk of Blades went still for a long moment. Then, by degrees, he straightened. His hands went slowly to his sides. He stepped back. Nora lowered last word. She did not speak. She turned and walked back to the human table and sat down in her chair behind Rael's left shoulder. She set last word on the table in front of her and pressed her sleeve against the cut on her shoulder. The room was silent. Then, from the Vorth side of the table, one sound. A single slow clap. Counselor Sova was looking at Nora with an expression that was hard to name. Not surprise. Something more like recognition. She clapped once more. And once more. Steady. Nobody joined her yet. But she did not stop. The session broke for 40 minutes. Taryn wrapped Nora's shoulder with a medkit from the prep room and did not say anything stupid, which she appreciated. When the chamber reconvened, the air had changed. It was not a large change. It was not the kind of thing you could point to and name. But Nora had grown up reading rooms the same way she read terrain. The temperature had shifted. The Dusk of Blades was in his seat. He did not look at her when she came in. He looked at the table in front of him. His blade was at his side where it had always been. He had not moved it, but he sat differently. The weight of him was lower. Not humbled. Not beaten. Something more complicated than that. High Speaker Oro opened the session and asked if both delegations were prepared to continue. Rael said yes. Dusk of Blade said yes. Then Counselor Sova asked for the floor. Oro granted it. Sova stood. She was smaller than the others in her delegation, built leaner, with the shorter plating of the Vorth trade caste rather than the warrior caste. She had dark gray eyes, and she used them carefully. She addressed the human table directly, not through formal phrasing. Directly, the way you talk to someone when you have decided they are worth talking to honestly. "I have a question," she said, for the human aide. Rael turned slightly in his seat. Nora gave him a small nod. "Ask," Nora said. "Yesterday," Sova said, "the first member of our delegation made a remark about your presence at this table. You did not respond. I watched your face. You heard it. Why did you not answer?" The room was quiet. This was not a hostile question. It was a real one. "I was not here to speak yesterday," Nora said. "I was here to listen. There is more information in a room when you are quiet than when you are talking. And today the room needed something different." Sova considered this. "On my world," she said, "silence in the face of insult is read as submission. Our young are taught this. If you do not answer, you accept the statement as true. On my colony," Nora said, "silence is sometimes how you let something carry its own weight until it falls." Sova was still for a moment. Then she turned slightly toward Dusk of Blades and said 2 words in Vorth. The bead translated them as she understood. Dusk of Blades did not respond, but his jaw moved once, the way a person's jaw moves when they are holding something inside. Sova turned back to the table and shifted to the trade agreement. She began asking questions. Real ones. Detailed ones about route access, resource exchange rates, the human colony infrastructure along the contested corridor. She had read the briefing documents. She had done the work. Rael answered her. Carefully, fully, the way he answered someone he now believed was actually listening. The session moved. Not quickly, but it moved an hour in. Taryn passed Nora a folded note under the table. She opened IT. IT was from Rael. It said, "They're moving." She wrote 1 word underneath it and slid it back. "Good." She watched the room. The Vorth delegation was no longer a single block. Sova and 2 of the trade caste representatives were asking questions and making notes. Dusk of Blades and the warrior caste members were still. Not obstructing, just still. There was a difference between someone who opposed you and someone who had run out of the thing that made them loud. Dusk of Blades had not changed his mind about humans. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But he had run into something he did not have a ready answer for, and it had taken the sound out of him for now. That was enough. Sova was doing the rest. Near the end of the session, High Speaker Oro made a procedural announcement. The final vote on equal trade recognition would take place the following morning. Both delegations were asked to submit their final positions in writing before midnight. Rael nodded. His voice, when he thanked Oro, was steady, but Nora could hear the relief underneath it. He was a man who had spent a career believing that enough careful words, spoken to the right people at the right time, could move anything. And he was right that he was just sometimes wrong about which words needed to be spoken first. The last session began without ceremony. High Speaker Oro took his seat. Both delegations filed in. The room was the same cold pale light, the same long tables. The standing point post had been removed from the floor overnight. Only the mount remained, a small square plate flush with the ground, easy to miss if you were not looking. Nora sat behind Rael's left shoulder. Her shoulder was bandaged under her jacket. It pulled when she breathed too deep, but it was clean. She had slept 4 hours and woken before the lights came up. Oro opened the session and went directly to the vote. He summarized both positions without editorializing. The human delegation sought equal trade recognition and corridor access. The Vorth delegation had the deciding vote in the joint council. He asked the Vorth delegation for their final position. The Dusk of Blades rose. The room was very still that he spoke for less than a minute. Short sentences. No ceremony. He said that after the events of the prior session, the warrior caste bloc was withdrawing its formal objection to equal trade recognition. He gave no speech about it. He did not explain or justify. He stated it as a fact and sat down. He looked at Nora once while he was sitting. One look. It was not warm. It was not an apology, but it was level. He looked at her the way you look at something that has earned the right to be seen. Then he looked away. The vote went to the full Vorth Council on record. When Oro read the result, the count was clear. Equal trade recognition passed out Rail's hands, folded on the table, pressed together once. That was all. He was not a man who showed things in his face. But Nora had worked beside him for 6 years, and she saw it. Taryn at the sidewall exhaled so hard the delegate beside him turned to look. High Speaker Oro called Nora forward. She stood and walked to the front. Oro explained, for the record, that under Vorth tradition, the member of a delegation who stood at the standing point was the one who sealed the agreement on behalf of their party. He held out the seal plate, a flat silver disc the size of a palm, warm to the touch, already humming with the faint charge that would record the mark permanently. Nora pressed her thumb to it. The disc lit once. The record was made. She walked back to her seat. As the chamber emptied and the delegates moved into smaller conversations, Counselor Sova crossed to the human side. She stopped beside Nora and looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then she looked at Nora's left arm. At the sleeve. The scar, she said. How did you get it? Nora told her. Short version. Just the facts. Colony world, bad storm, animal in the fence line, a blade from the equipment shed. A choice made in about 2 seconds. Sova listened without moving. You were a child, she said. I was the one standing there. Sova nodded once, slowly. On my world, the young are trained for years before they are permitted to stand at a challenge post. There are forms to learn. Positions. Histories. She paused. You learn none of that. No, Nora said. And yet, Sova looked toward the place where the standing point had been. The result is the result. She turned back to Nora. I want you to understand something. What happened in this chamber will be recorded. It will be discussed. The warrior caste will tell one version of it. I will tell another. My version will reach more people because I speak to traders and diplomats and people who move things across 100 systems. Nora waited. I will tell them, Sova said quietly, that humanity should not be underestimated. Not because of your weapons or your numbers, but because of what you are willing to do with nothing. She glanced at last word on Nora's hip. A small blade, a choice, and a refusal to be made small. She turned and walked toward the exit without waiting for an answer. Nora stood for a moment. The chamber was almost empty now. Rail was speaking with Oro near the far door. Taryn was collecting data pads from the table and trying not to smile too wide. She walked to the observation deck. The same seat, the same porthole, the same gas, giant Sarev, turning below, orange and slow and vast. She sat down. She took out last word and held it in both hands. Not sharpening it, just holding it, feeling the weight of it. The worn handle and the plain steel and the tip that she always kept sharp. Taryn came in 10 minutes later. Rail wants to celebrate, he said. There is apparently real food somewhere on this station. Nora looked at the planet below. Ask me when we get home, she said. Taryn smiled and sat down beside her, and together they watched Sarev turn in the dark, slow and quiet and completely indifferent to the small and stubborn creatures circling above it.